It's time for me to review Orbital by Samantha Harvey. I wouldn't normally post a book review this late at night, but I thought since I sort of started the day with my little parody video of reading this, I thought it was only appropriate given this book's nature about a group of people in a space station orbiting the Earth in one day. I thought it might be sort of nice to finish the day with this review. I feel like there are going to be people who DNF this book, maybe a third of the way through, a fourth of the way through, and they're going to write it off as a sort of piece of, pretentious dreck that's being overlauded. And I wouldn't necessarily blame them for that view, because I'm going to tell you, it took a long time for this book to sort of insinuate itself on me. In fact, it took about half the book. Thankfully, in this case, half the book is only 100 pages. Now, the complaints that I initially had about this book when I started reading it are still there. It's just a lot of listing, and I don't think that Harvey's writing, at least to me, wasn't really strong enough to carry the idea of what she's trying to do here. It did start to get repetitive, and it wasn't for a lack of trying. I mean, there are just, at the end of the day, there's only so many ways to really describe the Earth floating by. And she does a beautiful job of it, but it did get repetitive for me. It really did. Many things in this book got repetitive. A lot of the sort of emotional content or thematic content seemed sort of circular, and I found that very difficult to just deal with. Like, it just wasn't really a pleasurable reading experience for most of this book, other than there are some beautiful words and there are beautiful moments, here and there early on in the book that I could attach to. However, some of the sort of stylistic choices that at first really kind of bothered me, I began to understand more and more as the book went on. Chief among these is that she will often refer to the astronauts on the space station as a unit, as they. And they are doing things that aren't, obviously, they couldn't be done in unison, and surely not all of them are doing it. But, as you go along in the story, it becomes clear that this is definitely a sort of poetic, usage to give them a sense of being one being. Because in some ways, as you kind of walk through the book, this they becomes you. And you start to see that I think what Harvey is doing is trying to erase some of those boundary lines between not just the people on this station, but the people there and the people on Earth, and by extension, us and them. It's a whole thing. And at first, it really irritated me. But as I began to get a sense of what Harvey was doing, I was like, oh, okay, this is actually pretty cool. Like, I actually really like this. Because there are a couple moments in this book where she essentially grabs the reader, plonks you down into the body of an astronaut, and has you experience their life through their eyes. And I think those are incredibly effective, and I found them very interesting and moving, and it kind of gave me an anchor, because I think that's what I was sort of looking for early on in this book. You sort of just flit around people's brains, and you go to Earth, and you go back up to their heads, and you go into their dreams. You briefly visit their family members, but it's in the past. Like, there's a lot of just flitting around without a lot of anything to kind of grab onto as a reader. But then one of the mothers of one of the astronauts die, and this really provides a really strong sort of emotional something that the book can then kind of play off when it's talking about its grander, more eloquent ideas. As a sci-fi fan, and I have read a lot of sci-fi, especially in my youth, a lot of what's being talked about here and being gone through isn't particularly fresh or new to me. Even like the perspective of space and the sort of philosophical musings and the emotion, what does that mean, and the loneliness of it. Like, I've read a lot of that before. And so this sort of smacks of, it's like the literary fiction writer comes in to this space and thinks they're doing something really new, but they're not. But that's okay because, when it comes to writing, I don't think new is so much important as the way it's done and put together. And that was what really turned it around for me. From that first kind of like, oh, that was my first feeling was, okay, this is a literary writer coming into this sort of sci-fi space and thinking they're doing something new with it. Is there really anything being added to it? It was a pretty cynical point of view, to be honest. But I was just, reacting to the text. But then as I got further into the book, I really started to break down that kind of cynicism and really embrace more of what Harvey is doing here. I have always loved space. I wanted to go to space camp. I wanted to be an astronaut. Before I realized I wasn't great at math and I grew to be 6'5". So that pretty much precluded my astronaut dreams. But I really wanted to be an astronaut. I had the toy space shuttle. When I was in school, we entered this contest to name the space shuttle. I think the Endeavor was the one that won, but we did this full cockpit out of cardboard, and all the the buttons were bottle caps. So I mean, it was a big deal. Space is a big deal to me. And space exploration, this idea of a time when I was younger where it was a noble pursuit by humanity. I think it's viewed very much differently now. And this book grapples with that. The privatization of space, the sort of vacuous feeling that can come from that, like the massive amounts of money that's mentioned multiple times, that the money it takes to get someone up into space, and what do we get out of it? It's very interesting. It's an interesting part of this book that I'm glad it dealt with. So by the end of this book, I really came to like this book. I don't love it. There are issues I have with it still. And I think that some of that's kind of down to the way the style hit me. It felt a little flat. But as the book kind of builds to its ending, I did feel the power of the thought behind it. And it felt good. It felt like somebody who really, just sort of uncynically, with knowledge and heart and empathy and artistic power, reaching out through the page and trying to mold these big ideas into something. And that counts for a lot for me. I'm willing to overlook some of the quibbles. Now, recommending this is hard because I think it's a certain kind of person who's going to like this. And I feel like you have to have patience with it. And you have to just sort of trust in the process of what's happening within the book. And yeah, I think there's stuff that you have to overlook. But for me, the journey ended up being very much worth it. I basically read this almost in one sitting. It was like 1.5 sittings, I think. So it's not necessarily a quick read because of the style of it and the lack of dialogue, but it wasn't, a big time investment by any means. So if you are intrigued by Orbital, I'd say check it out. Try it out. Give it a little time, and maybe you'll like it as well. But I will say, if you don't want to invest the time in this, I do think, in a lot of ways, all the big emotion and ideas and feelings that are in this book, I think David Bowie managed to sum up in 2 lines from a song. And it goes, "Planet Earth is blue, and there's nothing I can do."